Constitutional change is back on the agenda, and with me today to discuss the process of constitutional change and just how difficult that is in Australia is one of the country's leading constitution experts, UNSW's Anthony Mason Professor of Law, George Williams. Welcome, George. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Now, very aptly, you've just written a book on this very subject, People Power, the history and future of the referendum in Australia. So you're exactly the person we need to be speaking to. Why is constitutional change so difficult in Australia?
Well, it always tends to be topical because Australians are aware of the fact we've got a very old constitution, one of the oldest in the world, and they're also aware of the fact that it's almost impossible to change. So we've got a document there that has stayed static over a very long period of time, and that often gets in the way of some big reforms that are needed. So when Australians talk about health and education, our federal system, they know that involves constitutional change, or Indigenous recognition, or a host of other issues like the Republic. So it's always on the agenda, but what's changed now is that we've had the election of a Gillard government via a hung parliament, and she said that during this term there will be a referendum. Indigenous recognition and local government recognition, the two issues on the table at the moment, and that will be Australia's first referendum in more than a decade, the last being in 1999.
So we're going to hear a lot more about referendums in the coming months. A recent, well, fairly recent survey found that not even half of the Australian population actually knew that we had a written constitution. So there is a degree of ignorance out there about what the constitution is. Why is that?
Look, I agree, and we are dealing with the need to change a document where a large number of people don't know the document exists. And that's an enormous challenge for reformers. And they don't know the document exists because I think partly it's worked really well, and sometimes, like a good engine, if it works well, you don't even think about it. It's simply not there and things just go on as they should, and that indeed describes much of Australia's political system. It's only when you do have a constitutional crisis like the sacking of the Whitlam government in 1975, or something uncertain like a hung parliament, that Australians even start thinking about what underlies that system, what makes it work. But the other problem is, I think, a failure of education, that we have a system where kids aren't often given what they need to understand our constitution, and that I think is a problem, because if you want people to be good citizens, to hold governments to account, they need to know the basic rules. The fact that they don't does cause big problems, and it's not just a matter of not knowing it exists, it's often a matter of false information. A survey taken not so long ago asked Australians, do we have a National Bill of Rights? And of course we don't, but 61% said yes. And what it says is that when we're looking at popular education, it's often Australians getting their information not from universities or schools, but from US cop shows like Law and Order, and that has a big impact on what Australians know and often don't know about their system of government.
It's obviously important to change the constitution where necessary and to keep it relevant and up to date. But Australia's constitution, as you've said, is very difficult to change. How do we go about changing a referendum, changing the constitution via referendum?
Well, when the drafters wrote the Constitution, they did set down an amendment mechanism, and everything has to be changed, and their expectation is it would need to be changed over time. But what they did in what was quite a radical democratic experiment for the time is said, let's not just have Parliament, our politicians making the change, let's not have a convention, both of those being common systems overseas, particularly in the United States. Let's instead give the people the first and final say. So the people are the only ones that can authorise a change to the Constitution. What it requires to actually get that change up is, firstly, Parliament debates a proposal, comes up with an idea. It must get through that body first. It then goes to the Australian people and they vote at a national referendum. So it's like a normal poll that we have for election day, but except it's a vote on a specific proposal. Do we, for example, support changing the Constitution to give the federal Parliament more power over something like ports or the Murray-Darling or something like that? And if the people vote yes, then the referendum is successful and the Constitution is changed. But the yes vote itself is a special type of yes vote. It's a double majority, so you need both a national majority, 50% plus, and a majority of the Australian states, so 4 out of the 6 voting yes. And that's proven a very, very high hurdle, because of the 44 proposals that have got to the people, only 8 have actually been passed.
In your book, you've outlined the history of these referendums in Australia. What were some of the standout referendums from your point of view?
Well, of the 44, there have been some which have been of enormous importance to Australia's society, and you can turn to the 1951 referendum dealing with the banning of the Communist Party. We did vote as a nation whether to ban a political party. It was suggested that if we'd agreed to do so, it would have fundamentally changed our character as a nation, that instead of being an open and free democracy, we would have started making choices about what is legitimate political view, and in fact we would have potentially started jailing communists and their sympathisers. That was a referendum where it was thought it would overwhelmingly pass. Sir Robert Menzies, the Prime Minister, put it. 80% of Australians thought it was a good idea at the time, but over time that support was whittled back, particularly by H.V. Evatt, who fought against the proposal, and when it went to the polling day, Australians very, very narrowly voted no. And in doing so, they preserved, I believe, the form of democracy that we've got today. Another really important one is the 67 referendum that we celebrated not so long ago, the 40th anniversary of it, that being the referendum that deleted discriminatory provisions against Aboriginal people and also put new text in the Constitution, or at least changed text to enable the Federal Parliament to pass laws for them. But it's a good example of a referendum that's proved to be double-edged, because it did those good things, but equally it didn't put anything positive in the Constitution. It didn't actually recognise Aboriginal people. Instead it left a silence, and it also left other provisions that remain discriminatory in that document, and they're things which suggest that even though it was an enormous victory for Aboriginal people, the law left a bit to be desired, and we need another referendum to do the unfinished business of 1967.
Mm-hmm. And the most recent referendum that we had was the referendum for the Republic in 1999, but that was unsuccessful.
That's right. So 1999 was the last referendum, and it's been a long time since drinks in Australia. In fact, the decade just past is the first decade in Australia's history where we have not had a referendum. And it's this lock that we've got into where on the one hand we increasingly need constitutional change, yet on the other it's becoming less frequent and more difficult to achieve. Leaving us with the document that, even though it's got some great strengths, is very much out of date in some key areas. But the Republic referendum was one that galvanised the population like no other, because it was about an issue of identity, because it was raising questions of where we want to head as a nation, and some quite deep-seated issues of identity amongst whether we're monarchy or British or whatever it might be. It brought people out in enormous numbers, and in doing so, it really ultimately polarised the community. 45% voted yes. The majority, however, voted no, and even though a majority of Australians, it seems, supported a republic, not enough supported this particular proposal, and hence it was lost. The Labor Party, of all of our sides of politics, has been conspicuously the most unsuccessful. They're the ones who see themselves as the great reformers. They've put the most referendums. 25 of the 44 are ALP-sponsored referendums, but of those 25, only one has ever succeeded in 1946 under Ben Chiefeley. So they have a 1 in 25 success rate. That's a 96% failure rate. And as we head to a referendum under the Gillard government, it means they really have some lessons they need to learn about how to win one of these national polls.
Yeah, it doesn't bode well for the upcoming referendum. Obviously, you know, a good read of your book by the government would be worthwhile.
Best place to start.
Okay. All right, let's hope they do that. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.